Welcome to the podcast on almost everything important. I'm Professor Raymond L. Williams, Distinguished Emeritus Professor of the University of California and author of 16 books. Bienvenidos al podcast sobre casi todo lo importante. Yo soy el Profesor Raymond L. Williams de la Universidad de California y autor de 16 libros. Today's podcast is in our Big Books series. This is the series of books, 64 of them, of course. This is the series of 64 books that are basically just big, complex, and in my opinion, interesting. That is, I don't really have a high definition for what a big book is. I'm not claiming that they're all classic books or that there are even any classic books here. They're just long books, complex for the most part, and in my opinion, as I said, interesting books worthy of a podcast in this series called Big Books. Today's big book that I'm simultaneously doing on YouTube and in the podcast is called Metatron. So here it is by Philip Potdevin. So for those of you that are listening to the podcast, you'll have to excuse me, there's some visuals going on, but maybe that's your invitation to find the YouTube version of this podcast. So I want to talk about this novel called Metatron as a part of this series, but in the context of what I call total novels. And this comes from Spanish, novela total. Hoy voy a hablar en esta serie de Big Books de la novela Metatron que acabo de mostrar aquí en este YouTube bilingüe y este podcast bilingüe. Quiero hablar de Metatron como novela total de una manera muy introductoria. Esto no pretende ser un seminario sobre la novela total. So the term total novel, novela, was popularized much more in Spanish. I've never actually heard the term used in English other than by persons such as myself, that is, professors of Latin American literature that are speaking, kind of translating from Spanish, novela total. It was a term highly popularized by the big name writers of the 20th century, the writers of that 1960s boom, such as Carlos Fuentes. So here I have another of the big books. And so what I want to do in this podcast and in this YouTube is introduce the concept of the big books for my second time, actually, because I've done another brief introduction to these total novels on another podcast and on another YouTube. But I want to talk about Metatron in the context of introducing other total novels or novelas totales. Entonces voy a hablar de otras novelas totales. Primero, Terra Nostra de Carlos Fuentes. So the first total novel I want to talk about is Terra Nostra by Carlos Fuentes. This thing is, let me look here. I'm looking at the page number, the pagination. This is a 774-page novel in the English translation. I don't happen to have the original Spanish version here as I sit here at my table doing this podcast and this YouTube. But here it is, and I really wanted you to see the size of it. That's one of the advantages of the YouTube over the podcast. You can see these are long and complex novels, and as a matter of fact, the complexity I deal with in a book called The Writings of Carlos Fuentes. Don't be fooled by the title. It's not really about just the writings of Carlos Fuentes. It's really a book about Terra Nostra. So, but my editors wouldn't allow me to call the book an analysis of Terra Nostra or a reading of Terra Nostra, because there aren't more than about 20 readers in the world of a book with a title like that. So we call it The Writings of Carlos Fuentes, and we introduce Carlos Fuentes in the book, his total work. It's kind of an intellectual biography to start with. It's an overview of all of his work, the rest of his work, the rest of his novels of the 20th century in the context of Terra Nostra. And that's where I have my analysis of Terra Nostra. So I'm not going to try to to do any analysis, particularly of Terra Nostra, or actually of any other of these books, because this isn't a graduate seminar. It's a podcast, and it's a YouTube. By the way, this novel Terra Nostra was published in 1975. So this is one of our early total novels, although the one that's missing that I didn't happen to bring copies of to this table is Conversación en la Catedral, Conversation in the Cathedral by Mario Vargas Llosa. La novela que falta en este podcast que quisiera destacar, además de Terra Nostra, es Conversación en la Catedral de Mario Vargas Llosa, también una de las primeras novelas totales. Se comenzó a hablar de esto a mediados de los años 60, cuando Carlos Fuentes y Mario Vargas Llosa popularizaron el término. Después, hablando del siglo XXI, voy a ir adelante y atrás en términos temporales. Tenemos 2666 de Roberto Bolaño, 2 generaciones después del boom, y entonces una muestra que la novela total no ha muerto. My next visual example that I'm showing on YouTube, but I can't show on podcast, is this novel I'm holding up called 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. Living proof that total novel wasn't just an invention of the writers of the boom. There were total novels written well before the 1960s boom of the Latin American novel, and there have been some novels since then. And Bolaño, who's kind of like the voice of 21st century Latin American fiction, he shouldn't be the voice because there are at least 15 or 20 novelists just as accomplished in Latin America as Bolaño, but in any case, he's certainly an important one. And so there's another example of the total novel. Let me see. I want to give you the page numbers on this one. 1112 in the original version in Spanish, 1,000-page novel. Okay, then to speak of a novel in Brazil, the total novel of Brazil, although I could think of 3 or 4 competitors, would be Grande Sertão Veredas by João Guimarães Rosa, published in 1956 in Portuguese, of course, 460-page total novel. And so you might be saying, so what's the big deal? There are a lot of 500-page novels that have been published, but I guess that to be a total novel and to be in my big book series, you have to be both long and complex. And there are few books as complex as this one, beginning with the linguistic complexity, because Grande Sertão Veredas de João Guimarães Rosa is not only written in Portuguese, but that's by incorporating in the Portuguese language several indigenous languages that Guimarães Rosa learned, self-taught. So he learned these indigenous languages, and he throws in these words and phrases as if they're Portuguese, but actually, if you read twice or 3 times, even if you know Portuguese, you realize, like, I don't actually know what this technically means. Like, I've never seen these words before. It's because they actually come from Guaraná and other languages that are indigenous to Brazil. So that's the complexity, along with the length and everything else related to this novel, such as the structure. So, let me show you one more written in Spanish before I move to some things written in other languages that, as a Latin Americanist, I see as a total novel. Now, here's one that some professors of Latin American literature even might not have heard of. This is called La Historia by the Argentine writer Martín Caparrós, who's an accomplished writer in Argentina. If you consult my other series that's not the big books on these podcasts that you can find on our website, which is www.thetop64.com, you can see that I have a series of introductions to writers such as Martín Caparrós that are relatively unknown or unrecognized, relatively speaking, outside of the nation in which the writer is from, in this case, outside of Argentina. not that many people have read Caparrós, and you probably haven't read him in English translation. If you're a very literary American, you might not, and looking for Latin American fiction, even the more informed readers of Latin American fiction in the United States might not have heard of Martín Caparrós. But here we are. Let me give you the pagination on this thing. This is well over 1,000 pages. Actually, near the end, 920, page 924, so close to 1,000 pages on this one too, La Historia by Martín Caparrós. But as a reader of Latin American fiction that also reads in other languages, you know, I run into things that for me are total novels. And so this would be a prime example. William H. Gass, The Tunnel. If I read this in Spanish, this would be one of our total novels. And Gass has passed away, of course, unfortunately, recently. So I don't know what he would think about this, but I think he would love it to know that I'm doing a podcast today on the Latin American total novel, and his novel, The Tunnel, is included. And let me see, before I forget, let me tell you about the pagination. This is a long, rambling novel that I'm sure English professors have other ways of describing and categorizing and discussing and all of that. But I'm going to tell you a secret. I hope you don't steal the secret. You know, I don't think that I'm in great danger because I don't think that many people are really going to see either this podcast or this YouTube other than my reliable friends. This one's only 651 pages, but again, it's a monster. And it's a rambling, complex thing that's typical of these total novels. What they all have in common is they're encyclopedic. You know, they cover a range of encyclopedic information that you could spend years researching. Maybe not as many years today in the world of Google, because we can Google all these different references to different historical times, different historical characters, different literary characters that are all mixed into all these things. As a matter of fact, wouldn't it be cool if some postmodern writer took all of these and rewrote the whole thing and wrote for us a 5,000 page novel called The Total Novel. In any case, it would be an encyclopedia of knowledge, because each of these books is so encyclopedic that it boggles one's mind to think that one person wrote these books. And for the most part, they were written, again, before the days of Google, when you know, they involved a lot of research, a lot of timely research, years and years of research. Most of them are the product of at least 15 years of researching and writing and more researching and more rewriting and all of that. But that's another topic. But something I'll probably touch upon, as I was starting to say, my current plan is to write a book on these total novels as total novels. And that's my current research plan, as I finish some work in Tolima and finish some work on a writer that I'm going to mention in my last total novel. And so, as I mentioned in our previous podcast, another book that I put in with the total novels would be The Arcades Project by Walter Benjamin. Because another thing these writers tend to have in common is that Fuentes would be the exception, but a lot of them not only have totalizing careers as writers of total novels, but they have totalizing and encyclopedic careers overall. They've spent a lifetime exploring, you know, vastly different, complex areas of knowledge, and that's what comes out in the Arcades Project. This encyclopedic fascination with minutia that Benjamin explores in the Arcades Project, which I think comes across much better as a novel, as an essay, because as I pointed out in my podcast on this book, it's not really a very good essay, because it doesn't have either much of a theory or proposal. It proposes nothing and it concludes nothing when it gets right down to it, as is the case, of course, of each of these novels, because they're novels, they're not essays. They don't pretend to propose or conclude anything. as a lot of our social scientists sometimes have difficulty understanding when they read these things. They want proposals and conclusions, and they become very critical sometimes of writers that don't have proposals and conclusions. So my last total novel that I wanted to introduce today is that I'm going to introduce it a little bit more than the other ones, because it's kind of the subject of this podcast in the Big Book series. It's called Metatron. So here it is. And this is one of the main reasons why I needed to do this podcast on YouTube rather than just as a podcast, because this novel has a lot to do with the visual world that we can cover a little bit better on the YouTube than we can on the podcast. Because first of all, let me do a close-up on the YouTube of the cover. Take note that this is a painting from the 18th century that's reproduced on the cover here. So, and then you saw that, and then for those of you listening to the podcast, there are a series of paintings in this nice edition of this novel. This is a 6 Parral, Biblioteca Breve edition, so this is a nice edition in the Spanish language. Entonces, esta es una edición muy bonita en lengua española de 6 Parral, Biblioteca Breve, de mucho prestigio, como saben los oyentes de la lengua española. Y ahora que he hablado de repente mucho en inglés de los otros libros, voy a hablar un poquito más de este libro en español y también en inglés. So I guess this podcast, even though I want to make it bilingual, I went quite a bit into English in describing these other books, these other total novels. So I'm going to try to be better here at the rest of this and balancing Spanish and English in this podcast. But como estaba diciendo, en este podcast lo estoy combinando con un YouTube, porque el Metatron es algo que se discute mejor visualmente. Como se ve en la tapa, hay un cuadro y también hay varios cuadros dentro de la novela. Voy a abrir un cuadro aquí del siglo XVIII. Entonces, estos son cuadros que el autor Philip Potdevin encontró en una iglesia en Bogotá, Colombia, a finales de los años 80 o principios de los 90, cuando estaba cocinando esta novela, cuando estaba comenzando a pensar en el tema o el asunto, vamos a decir, de esta novela. So there are these pictures within Metatron that are inviting me to do this more as just as much as a YouTube as a podcast. And there's a series of these pictures. I'm going to show you another one. Voy a mostrar otro cuadro. Pueden ver que estoy como hojeando el libro. Y son cuadros, voy a decir, curiosos. Porque son, en el fondo, cuadros. Vamos a ver, aquí hay otro. Son cuadros religiosos. O sea, están en una iglesia en Bogotá y han sido trasladados de un monasterio del siglo XVIII en Bogotá, Colombia. Han sido trasladados a la iglesia donde los encontró Potdevin. Aquí tengo unas reproducciones de los cuadros que quiero mostrar. Estos son, porque originalmente los cuadros estaban en una iglesia en Bogotá y han sido trasladados ahora a una capilla en el pueblo de Sopó. Entonces aquí están. Oh, están al revés. Okay, está bien así. And so here are the pictures in a larger reproduction, but they're full-size paintings in a chapel in the town of Sopó, which is in Colombia, near Bogotá. So if you go to Sopó, you can see these cuadros, these paintings. Like I say, these are small reproductions that I was able to buy, put in my suitcase, and bring back here to Southern California to study. But Let me show you this one right here. This is actually a male figure, but look how feminized it is. It's a very feminine looking, and it's got this lace. Look at this lace here. For those of you that are listening on the podcast and wondering what we're doing, this is a painting of a male, but he's got kind of a almost dress-like looking. He's dressed almost in a dress, and he's got this lace down over his leg. These are supposedly military figures, but they're highly feminized military figures, and they're very erotic looking things, particularly if you think about the fact that they're supposedly religious paintings. What are these things doing in a church? So here's another one of an archangel. These are archangels. Here's an archangel, and look at this lace on this archangel. So this is kind of like, I guess I'm going to go ahead and say it, this is kind of like 18th century church pornography. I mean, these are things that, priests were looking at for stimulation, or monastery members, whatever you call them. I guess they're priests. Anyway, so I'm going to show you one more. Here's another archangel dressed up like a military, kind of like fake military dress and all this. And so I'm showing you all of this. It's just one tiny introduction to the complexity of this novel. Estoy mostrando estos cuadros en este YouTube y estoy hablando de esto en este podcast como una entrada a una novela muy interesante, muy compleja, pero todas estas novelas totales siempre tienen claves, siempre están escritas en varios niveles de conocimiento, revelando varios niveles de conocimiento, pero con claves. So there are always these hidden, they're frequently, I shouldn't say always, but frequently in these encyclopedic total novels, there's this encyclopedic knowledge, but there are these levels of knowledge that only the insiders who are privileged to the information might have access to. And it goes deeper and deeper. Terra Nostra and Fuentes Terra Nostra becomes a little scary at a certain point because he goes into these hermetic texts that have been kind of forgotten from esoteric forms of medieval knowledge, esoteric pieces of medieval knowledge. So this isn't medieval, but it has much of the same kind of both esoteric and erotic drive that are found in some of these other novels. Entonces, esta es mi introducción a esta novela enciclopedia totalizante, novela total, que se llama Metatron. Voy a sacar Metatron aquí de mi pila de novelas y de cuadros. Entonces, ahora tal vez pueden ver, si miran de nuevo con ojos más informados, el brazo en la cubierta es un brazo de un hombre, pero muy afeminado con el enlace en la ropa. And so now we look at even the cover of Metatron with new eyes, and we're noticing this lace that feminizes this male figure. And so, as I was saying, these novels tend to have various levels of encyclopedic information, encyclopedic knowledge. So each novel is, in a way, merits a lifetime of study. And I think that when the history of Latin American literature is written, and when the history of the total novel is written, there will be scholars that will spend a lifetime studying each of these novels. And I've noticed also that for the most part, no one understands these novels too well in less than about 15 years. So I received my first copy of Metatron in 1995 because I was just noticing that this copy is signed in 1995 by Philip Potdevin. And I just noticed this about 5 minutes before this podcast, actually. So that means that I've been aware of this novel for over 15 years, and I'm starting to understand it and starting to find some of the keys, some of the hidden clues that are going to lead me to a decent reading of Metatron, along with these other novels in my total novel project that I've started working on in the Spanish language, actually. So that's really what I have to say for this podcast and for this YouTube. I hope you find this introduction to these total novels helpful, and I invite you to join me in the study of Philip Potdevin's Metatron. You can find Philip Potdevin in Bogota, and if you prove to be a serious student, that is, a serious reader of this novel, with a little luck, you might be able to lure him into a little trip to Sopó, to the chapel, to see none other than these cuadros, these paintings on the wall in the chapel. And that, I believe, might lead you to further study, further informed study of this novel, Metatron. That's what I have for today's podcast and YouTube. Thank you very much for your attention, and I invite you to check out our website, www.thetop64.com, to see the complete list of all of our podcasts. Thank you very much.